Hello, welcome back to Pursuing God's Heart Yourself. And this is Titus part 2. We're going to look at another of the 7 principles to think about when we're trying to enjoy and feast on God's word for ourselves. We're in the little book of Titus. And after the opening, what we get right after that is an insight into the reason why the letter was written in the first place, which makes me flag up this principle. Texts make sense in context. That's true with text, with details, with paragraphs, sentences. Things make sense in their context. Now there's the written context, what's written before, what's written after, and how it flows together. And then there's the historical context. And that's what I want to focus on now, especially because we're in an epistle. Why was Paul writing to Titus? Well, we've got a little clue here in verse 5. This is why I left you in Crete. There we have a reference to a historical situation. Now, if you were to go through the book of Acts and try to figure out when is Paul in Crete and when does he leave Titus there, you don't find it. It seems to be that after Paul does his 3 missionary journeys in the book of Acts, gets arrested, spends time in prison in Caesarea, then is transferred to Rome, where he spends more time under house arrest at the end of the book of Acts. It's generally thought that he was then released. He then traveled again, and during those travels, he visited Crete, but he needed to keep moving, so he left Titus behind to represent him, to finish off what he'd started. He visited Ephesus, needed to keep moving, left Timothy behind, and to both of these men representing him, Paul wrote letters, Titus and 1 Timothy. Then he was arrested again, brought back to Rome, this time to face execution, and it's in that imprisonment that he writes 2 Timothy, 2 Timothy. So Paul's referring to the reason he left Titus in Crete. What was the reason? So that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. And that's what he develops first. He's going to go on to talk about putting things in order, but to begin with, he's going to talk about appointing elders. He wants elders, a plurality of spiritually qualified, mature men to lead the churches in each town. So if anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, the list goes on from verse 6 down to verse 9. But just keep that in mind as you're reading Titus. The reason Paul wrote this letter was that he wanted Titus to finish off what he had begun. Okay, so he'd been there as an apostle. He'd started things off, but there was more still to do. And so Titus was there not really as a pastor. I often see Titus or Timothy referred to as pastors. Really, they're representatives of the apostle. They're finishing off his instructions. And he had unique authority in that church, more than a pastor would. So apostolic representative Titus left on Crete in order to appoint elders and to put things in order. Now, further down, we get another little glimpse into what's going on. If you drop down to verse 12, you see this line here in quotes: Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. It's interesting, he says there in verse 12, one of the Cretans, a prophet of their own. And so he's here quoting one of the locals. It's not a biblical quote. It's a quote from Epimenides. It's a poem that Epimenides wrote about the Cretans and how even their actions are lies. And he gives the example of how they built a tomb for Zeus, the god. And that's patently a silly thing to do because Zeus is immortal. So why would you build a tomb for him? And a couple of lines later, he says, in him we live and move and have our being. Another time that Paul quotes Epimenides over in Acts 17, he uses that line. And so Epimenides, he's not teaching biblical truth, but he's giving us a contemporary kind of cultural insight into the context in Crete, on Crete. Always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Probably quite a tough place to do ministry, a tough place for Christians to exist, and therefore a place where Christians needed their churches to be well structured, well organized, and they needed the spiritual leadership that the elders would be able to give to them. Notice just the kind of familiarity of terminology. Back in the beginning, in the opening, he made reference to the fact that God never lies. God who never lies, promised beforehand, and so on. Here he's talking about the culture, always liars. The contrast between God and between God and the culture that Titus was in. So as you read through an epistle especially, you can look in Acts if it ties into that, but even within the text, look for any clues that are going to help to make sense of the setting, the context, the culture, anything that's going on that you can make sense of, and therefore help you understand what it is that's being written in this letter. So in chapter 1, you've got the difficult culture of Crete, and you've got the need for elders to be appointed, and what you'll find is a list of qualifications for elders followed by reasons why those elders are needed. Thank you so much, and join me again next time as we look at another principle to feast on the book of Titus.